welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
This is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and we have an awesome guest here today. Please tell us about yourself and your book.
Hi, my name is Addison Armstrong, and my debut historical fiction novel, The Light of Luna Park, is coming out August 10th of this year. And it's dual timeline. So the first part takes place in 1926, and a young nurse, Althea, has to decide whether to risk her job to save a baby's life. And she does make that decision, which ends up catapulting her into this very strange piece of history in Coney Island, where there was an entire incubator ward for premature babies who you could pay to see, like part of the freak show. And then the other timeline is 1950, 1951, and that's Stella. She's a special education teacher. She's having problems with her job, problems with her marriage, and she's grieving the loss of her mother. So she goes on a journey to find out who her mother really was and what secrets she was hiding from her.
The idea of babies being part of, as you mentioned, a freak show is jarring, I think, to people at first to think about. However, it was also one of those things where it saved so many lives. And the first time I actually heard about it, of all places, I was watching Boardwalk Empire. And I believe that's Atlantic City, though, I think.
He did have
yeah.
a ward at Atlantic City, and his daughter Hildegard ran that one. So
right, yeah, exactly. So that was the first time I had heard about this, and I think it was like in the first episode where Steve Buscemi's character is looking at the babies, and like it was interesting to me. And then to find out that there was also a ward on Coney Island, but people would pay, and it would in essence pay for these babies to be kept in these incubators, which saved their lives. Whereas exactly. And now things, I know people who have had babies very, very prematurely, and the science and technology has definitely advanced a lot since then. But to think about how it all got started is wild. So when you
So many people actually credit Dr. Coney, the one who ran those incubator wards, for bringing incubators into like the medical mainstream. And the first incubators in hospitals in like the Northeastern Seaboard was early 1940s. 1939 was the first one, and then 1940s. And that's when he shut down his own incubator wards. They were no longer necessary, but they definitely credit him. He saved estimates are 6,500 babies. Records were destroyed in fires at Luna Park, so no one's 100% sure. But he saved thousands of babies, and that finally convinced the medical establishment that, hey, this is something we can and should be doing.
And it's because his own background is kind of spotty.
Yes, extremely. Like, that's an understatement. He claimed that he was from France sometimes. He was really born in Poland. He was Polish Jewish. And he claimed to have gotten a medical degree in Berlin, but there's no record of that. His thesis does not exist. He was 19 when he immigrated to America, so that didn't give him time to do any of those things he claimed he did. His name wasn't his name. His name was initially Cohen or Cone, not Cooney, which he just completely invented before he even worked at Coney Island. So no connection, no intentional connection there.
Yeah, I know. That was one of those things where I was reading and I'm like, wait, is this Kismet, or is this yeah, right? Absolutely.
And it's not even a real name. I mean, Cooney is not a last name at all. So he just pulled it out of nowhere.
Did he change it because of prejudice, being Cohen being a Jewish name associated as
questions that no one's really 100% sure why he did anything he did, especially because he wasn't always super consistent with his lies. So he would tell some people he was born in France, some people he was born in Germany. He would spell his name with an accent over the E sometimes, but not always. That is definitely, a reason that people have speculated, but he also didn't hide his Jewish ancestry, so it's not entirely clear.
Yeah, it's, and this is like, I don't want to associate him with somebody who was not great, but it was like, he's like the light side, because I'm a big fan of Devil in the White City. It's almost like the light side of somebody like Henry Mudgett or H.H. Holmes, who used all of this to do horrible things. But with Coney, it was like he was able to advance something that saved so many lives. And you hear a lot of stories about babies being born prematurely in certain eras, and people just kind of expecting to lose babies, and like the mourning process being sort of like, well, you lose a baby every now and then.
Right.
But this was it. But what he did, like this whole thing, and what Althea in the book gets involved with, this was a real game changer.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for so many years. Yeah. I mean, for decades. And there are still a couple survivors from his incubators today. There's several interviews on the internet with people who were in Coney's incubators. So they lived, long, complete lives, obviously, and it's just bizarre. Wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you were writing Althea as a character, did you base her on anybody in particular? Were there like journals and stuff from people who worked the wards at the time?
I did not base her on anything in particular. I came up with her story, sort of two ways. So the first way was that many mothers did and fathers did say, I don't want to take my baby to Coney Island. My baby's not a freak. Like, obviously this is fate. This is what God has intended for my baby to die, which was so bizarre to me, but it was a different time. And that sometimes Coney had to come himself to the hospital and convince parents. He's like, I promise I can save your baby's life, and here they will die. Sometimes that changed their minds. Sometimes it didn't. There are survivors today who talk about, the woman in the bed next to their mother said, no, thank you. And that baby died the next day, whereas this one survived 80 years later. So it's bizarre that people really did refuse the services. But what really inspired Althea was just thinking he was a liar. Dr. Coney was a liar. He was a fraud. Ethically, there were a lot of issues. People said like ridiculous things about him. The New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, quite the name, accused him of exploiting the babies, endangering their lives, like all sorts of things. He was seen as very ethically degenerate at the time. And so in addition to just the sensationalism of these babies being on display, what really fascinated me about the whole thing was that sort of balance between, when do you lie and when do you invent a medical degree and do all these morally ambiguous things? When is it worth it? And so I decided to have Althea make those same choices. So that's sort of where she came from. She wasn't based on anyone in particular, though I did look through a lot of the yearbooks of the Bellevue, nursing school, and get an idea of what these women's backgrounds were and all of those things, but she wasn't based on anyone in particular.
I forget who I was talking to. There was another author we were talking to recently where we discussed how you picked the name of the characters. I remember she had mentioned, man, I can't remember now. Okay. I remember when we were talking to the other author, she had mentioned that she goes through census records, which I thought was very, very interesting. How did you decide to name Althea Althea?
Althea, I have done that a lot, the census records. Althea was not that. That, for some reason, it just popped into my head and I was like, that is who she is. And I kept it. It just really, really, for some reason, struck me as the right name. I think the only reason it was even in my brain is a mom of a kid at the preschool where I worked at the time was named Althea. I didn't intentionally name her after her, obviously, but I think that's why the name was even on my radar. But I have definitely looked through census records and then those yearbooks. And then Stella's name, of course, had reason in the book, but that's not, I guess, something to say without spoiling.
Yeah, we don't want to do that. The reason I ask, well, first of all, I am a name person. There's another reason I ask other than the census record thing, but I'm a huge name person. And Althea's name is Greek for with healing power.
Yes, I honestly don't even remember at this point if it made it into the final draft, I think it did, she references like the Greek
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and that was just like serendipitous. It was not intentional. And I mean, I realized it as I wrote and made it intentional, but when I picked her name, it wasn't because of that.
Well, that itself almost seems like fate, because it is I think a beautiful name, and her story is about something very beautiful, and she got a lot of doubt for what she wanted to do.
Right.
When you were forming Stella's story, it takes place quite a bit later, and she's coming from a different place than Althea. And there's a little bit, she's a special needs teacher. How did you decide to tie that in? Because I thought that was such a good connection.
I myself spent my 4 years of undergrad, which is when I was writing this book during undergrad, working at a school that was inclusive, so with and without special needs kids in preschool, and I just fell in love with them. But I knew obviously that special needs education, special education is more of a recent development than we often think it is. It was really like the Kennedy administration, and in 1975 they finally passed all the laws and the bills. So I was thinking a lot about what special education would have looked like at the time, and the fact that in Althea's timeline, they saw these babies as not worth living. So it was not only that it was expensive for these babies to survive and unlikely that they would survive, but there was also, it was the time of the eugenics movement was rising in America. I mean, it inspired Hitler later on. Like, it was very, very big. And at Luna Park, there was a Hall of Science with a big eugenics display, and they talked about propagation of the fittest and selective human breeding to get rid of the feeble, quote, feeble, degenerate, defective. And that same rhetoric surrounded children with special needs and disabilities at that time, of course, but also later in the 50s. So it seemed like a good parallel, and one that I really felt passionate about based on my experience with kids with special needs, who obviously were in a much, much more supportive and better environment today than in Stella's world.
Yeah, that's very true. And I don't really know how many people in this country realize how strong the eugenics movement was. It's really quite terrifying when one thinks about it and really just kind of looks at it. Like how
Definitely. And it was just right there next to the incubator wards. I mean, in addition to the Hall of Science stuff, they had Better Babies contests and Fitter Families contests that would be, all white families. They would measure like the baby's forehead and the baby's arms and everything about them. Do they have a rosy glow in their cheeks?
Right. Yeah.
To get a trophy because of the physical specimen that they were. And that was all happening, feet away from Dr. Coney, who was remarkable because a newspaper reported in 1917 that he treated babies regardless of race, creed, or color, which he had done since the beginning in 1903. But, it was reported then. And that was very, very, cutting edge for the time.
You've gotten so many good reviews for this book. This is your debut novel?
Yes, it is.
And how long did it take you to write?
About a semester of actual writing. I mean, it came pretty fast once I stumbled upon, the history. And then, another semester of working with my agent to do edits. And then, so about a year.
How did you stumble upon the story? And like, were you, so are you like a history major, an English major, a science major?
Education.
Ah, yes. Okay.
Yes. So elementary education in undergrad, and then I just finished my 1-year master's degree in May in reading education with an ESL endorsement. So education all the way. But I love history. And so I was reading some article about something historical, not nearly as exciting as these incubator babies, and it like popped up on the side, and it was one of those really clickbaity articles. It was like, how one man lied to save 6,000 children, and I was like, I don't think this is going to be real history. Like, it sounds kind of sketchy. But I couldn't not click on it. So I clicked on it, and my mind was blown when I read about it. And so I looked it up, and I found that, this random website was telling the truth. I got 2 books on like my Kindle that very night, read them both about it, nonfiction books. And I just could not stop talking about it, could not stop thinking about it. And that's how it happened.
Are you working on another book at the moment, or are you just going to take them? Oh, you're nodding. Audience, she's nodding.
Yes, I am. It's due in August, the final draft. So actually getting pretty close. And then I start teaching in August. So then I might need to pull back a little bit. But for now, I'm definitely working hard on that book. And it's another dual timeline historical fiction.
What can you say what time period it takes place in?
Yeah, so the first timeline is 1918, so right at the end of World War I, and then the second timeline is 1976.
Wow. Okay, those are 2 very
spread apart. Yeah.
But they're also, I think they're important. World War I stories. I feel like because World War II came like right after, sometimes they're eclipsed by World War II, and it's important to look at World War I and be like, why was there World War II?
Right.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like it's not because it did well in the theaters. Where it was right. There was many more reasons why this happened, but 1976 interests me a lot because I know a lot of people think about like the heat of the 60s as like this time of movement and protest, and what people think of as like the hippie times and everything is really like the very end of the 60s into the early to mid 70s, and then the mid 70s themselves is sort of coming out of that. So that's a really interesting time period in general. Like, so what are some of your favorite historical fiction books?
Ooh, all of them. I love Kate Quinn. She comes to mind. I just finished, The Rose Code.
Yeah.
And then of course the Alice Network and The Huntress are just phenomenal. I love Codename Helene.
Yes. Oh, my
podcast with her.
Yes, we interviewed that author last year, I believe. Okay. Yes.
And she's actually local to Nashville as well. So she lives. Oh, nice. I'm always hoping I'm going to run into her at the bookstore or something. Yes. But I love that one. I love all of it. I mostly read like 19th century onward. I definitely read earlier. But one good one that I liked that was a lot earlier was Sue Monk Kidd, about Jesus' wife. Have you read that one, The Book of Longings?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I just can't imagine the research that goes into one that's so ancient.
Yeah, I'm always pretty interested in that myself. And like that's one of those things where I start reading a historical fiction book and then I'll go down my own research hole and then I'll be taking out books while I'm reading this book and I'm like cross-referencing while I'm reading and I'm like, oh, and there it is. It happens. And that's this. So that's always that's always fun.
Yeah.
So I guess my last thing is there a dream period of time that you would like to write in, or have you already written in that?
That's a very good question. I don't think there is. I think I definitely like stories of women, and I like kind of those obscure stories, like you were saying. Not that World War I's obscure, but I found a piece of it that was a little bit more obscure, and it's definitely not written about as much as World War II. These baby incubators are so bizarre. Most people haven't heard of them at all.
And in general, the whole like freak show culture is very bizarre because of when you're talking about eugenics and you're talking about special education and just how people look at people. The fact that all of that happened and that was like a culture and you would pay money to look at somebody who
there was like a newspaper article that was talking about the babies and how it might have been an interview with one of the grown survivors of it, and she said something like the father of another child said, "Oh, I'm not going to, put my baby there to be part of a freak show like the fat ladies." As if the fat ladies are just really something. It's just insane to think how.
Yeah, like, oh, those fat ladies, like,
Right.
that's really,
That's the epitome of bizarre.
but it's so true. I mean, it really is. I've read a lot of stuff about, like Barnum and Bailey and Ripley's, and I mean Ripley, well, they were both show people, and they both were con men in their own right, but some of the stuff, like with the people, like on one hand, like somebody like General Tom Thumb, for instance, had like this whole lavish life because he was propped up, but then at the same time, like dehumanizing, and not everybody got named General, Tom Thumb. He just right. There's more to that. I don't want to get into that right now about him in particular, because he's like a historical figure I find very interesting, but just the whole culture behind, like sometimes these people would be sold by their parents because yes. They're like, well, I don't want this child who's got hair all over her to be like, right. This is a stigma, so
especially in the South.
Yes, absolutely. So it's really just it's really crazy, and it's nice to hear a story of something that affected a population in a positive way, especially since right. He was did not discriminate by race, or mm-hmm. that's pretty anti-eugenics.
Yeah,
because that's like the complete kind of like the polar opposite. Right. So I really like, this is a really cool story, and there are so many people who love historical fiction, and I know they're going to eat this one up.
I hope so.
And yeah, so I'm trying to remember if there was another question I had for you. Okay, all right. Is there anything else you want to add before we go?
I don't think so. This was really fun.
Yeah, please come back. Like,
I would love to.
Awesome. All right. Okay, so once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. Our guest today was
Addison Armstrong, author of The Light of Luna Park.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.